How does your visit to Africa contribute to conservation? That's the question I'm going to answer today. Here's a fact. Africa emits 3.5% of world global carbon emissions. Yet it houses 1.5 billion people. That's 20% of the global population emitting 3.5% of global carbon emissions. We are, here in Africa, the world's largest carbon sink. My name is Shem Kompian. I'm the co-founder and managing director of C4 Photo Safaris. I've traveled the world globally for the last 25 years, but Africa remains my muse. And today, I'm going to explain to you and share with you why coming to Africa contributes to conservation. Firstly, how large is Africa? If you look at a printed map, you'll see that Africa is roughly the same size on the map as South America. It's also on the map about a third the width of Russia. Yet, in real terms, Africa within it can fit China, India, the United States, the whole of Europe, Japan, and a couple of other small countries. The combined total population of all those countries comes to 4 billion people. And Africa, in the same landmass, houses 1.5 billion people. So, that equates to space. Africa has a lot of space. And that means that in that space, there's a lot of undeveloped land. And undeveloped land means that there's natural trees, grass, and other organisms living in that environment. If you fly over Africa, you'll fly over vast tracts of countryside where there are small villages living, but the most part is natural vegetation. There might not be large mammals there because that land is being lived on and utilized by humans, but the integrity of the land is in place. Now, what does that mean? There's been a lot of talk about sequestration of carbon by plants. And in Africa, we have large tracts of grassland. Open plains, woodlands, very different to forests of Amazon or in other parts of the world which are mostly forested areas. Here we have the ecosystems largely dominated by grass. And here lies the rub. Grass is an excellent sequestrator of carbon, but there's a fundamental difference. Trees are also very good carbon collectors, but where do they store the carbon? They store it in their roots and in their leaves above the ground. Grass stores it below the ground. So it takes carbon from the atmosphere and puts it deep into the ground. If there's a fire, no problem for grass. If there's a fire for forests, that carbon is released straight back into the atmosphere. So there's double jeopardy with forests. We want to protect them double as much. We want them to capture carbon, but we also don't want them to burn. Whereas grassland, because they are fire-driven systems, they sequestrate the carbon into the soil. Now, there's debate about which one is more effective, but the fact is that within Africa, which is a semi-arid environment for the most part, there is a lot more grass cover in Africa, and therefore the carbon sequestration is taken from the atmosphere and put back into the soil. So why does this matter? Many travel companies are making their guests pay for offsetting their carbon when they fly to destinations. I say, coming to Africa, you are coming to the largest carbon sink on the globe. And just by coming here, your carbon is already offset. And that brings us then to the actual tourism dollars that you are bringing when you come to Africa. Africa has 3 conservation models that by and large most of the continent operates on. Mass tourism, private conservancies, and then private nature reserves. The mass tourism models are pretty much run on national parks, and there are multiple national parks across Africa which You pay to enter, and those tourism dollars then go to protecting that land. Unfortunately, it has been documented, and there is evidence that many of the funds that go to national parks are mismanaged. Fortunately, because these parks are proclaimed from a federal level, they have to be preserved. And even better was that they were conserved because those areas were typically in vital ecosystems. And so the great ecosystems of Africa are very often national parks, well protected by federal law, where unfortunately tourism dollars not always going to the best outcome. Then we come to conservancies. And conservancies have different names, but typically what they are land that is leased by tourism companies around national parks or in other productive wildlife areas. Here there's an agreement and an arrangement between the tourism company who would like to use the land and the landholder. An agreement takes place where the land is going to be used for a certain purpose, mostly tourism, and the tourism side has to bring guests and act in a responsible manner. It's a very cooperative manner. Very often that land could have been used for other land uses such as farming, pastoralism, or even mining. But tourism there is playing a vital part in protecting that land. And because these areas are often around national parks, they provide a beautiful buffer around the national parks. So the core area of the national park, which as I mentioned, are normally critical and vital ecosystems, is now being protected by the buffer reserves on the outside. Probably the most well-known of these is the Okavango Delta, with multiple conservancies that are leased by landowners. And here the model has changed and morphed even more so, where the concessions are incredibly large. And the rules governing these concessions require only a certain amount of people, a very small number of people, and even only a set amount of roads that can be driven. What that translates to is that to manage these concessions becomes incredibly high cost. And so the model is low tourism numbers, so low impact, but high cost to the people that are visiting there. So that's a very small amount of people have this whole wilderness to themselves, but it comes at a good cost. The model itself has meant that the integrity of the Okavango Delta, in this instance, has remained really, really strong and is one of the great wilderness areas of Africa. The concession model runs all across Africa, not only the Okavango Delta, and there are very good examples in Zimbabwe with Hwangi, Mana pools, around South Luangwa and in other parts of Zambia, all the way up into Tanzania, and of course in Kenya too. So it's a very popular model that has gained a lot of traction in preserving land via tourism being the driver of the model in Africa. And then we come to private game reserves. And there are smaller numbers of these private game reserves in Africa, different to concessions. In here, the land is owned by the tourism operator. And so they've converted their land use into a private game reserve. Popular in South Africa, very popular in Namibia, and in small pockets around other parts of Africa. The Laikipia ranchlands and on the Laikipia Plateau in Kenya is probably a very good example of that too. Here, the owner owns the land. He uses it for wildlife tourism and conservation. And some of the projects that have run across Africa have become incredibly powerful in terms of their conservation efforts. And because here the landowner has full control. And when it comes to endangered species like rhino, they then are able to implement their strong anti-poaching and other elements to protect these species. Again, here, the cost is generally quite high. And it simply translates into where the money is going to. If you're going to be protecting endangered species in Africa, you need good resources on the ground to implement that protection. And so private reserves have become a strong base for protecting certain ecosystems in Africa, to the point that some areas, the private landowners have joined forces and expanded their reserves because the neighbors have dropped the fences and they've grown the land. So the whole ecosystem and the movement of animals within that ecosystem is a free-flowing one. So that explains where your tourism dollars are going to. And in my view, you coming to Africa, firstly, is a net carbon gain to the world because of how much carbon there is being sequestrated in Africa. And secondarily, how good concessions and private reserves provide buffer areas and protect strong ecosystems within Africa. National parks, we are very fortunate that they are protected by federal law. And so the buffer system works so well via the concessions. When coming to Africa, you can be assured that your tourism dollars are going to protect these areas. One thing you can be assured of is you will find space like we have here. And that's, I find, so reassuring. In Europe and the Americas and in Asia, you always seem to be queuing for a coffee or you're waiting to jump onto public transport. In Africa, we have an incredible amount of space. And we are so fortunate that so much of that has translated into good conservation areas. So come visit us in Africa, come on safari, and help us protect these great wildlife areas. Thank you.